This is Rudowski of WeAreChange here at the Red Pill Expo, joined today by Dr. Zach Bush, who just got off stage and was doing a really, really impressive presentation. And that's why in this video, we are going to be talking about your gut health, Cancer Alley, depression, Roundup, so many different things. And first of all, I kind of want to segment this interview into kind of two segments. The second part, I want to talk about the depression and just how important your gut is. And the first part, specifically about Roundup, because Roundup is in the news a lot today, specifically with the Bayer Monsanto lawsuits, which they are losing out big because it's coming out that they're manipulating so much of the documentation, so much of the information, so many of the authorities that people trusted. They bought off and sold with incorrect information for years that has hurt a lot of people. But you were on stage and you were saying this Roundup stuff is far more sophisticated and far more sinister than just the Hodgkin's lymphomas that we're hearing about. What can you tell us shortly about Roundup and from some of the investigations that you found out about that specific product?
Fantastic, yeah. So Roundup has been around since about 1974 in large-scale usage, but it really took off, in 1996 as we created the genetically modified Roundup-ready crops. So corn, soybean, subsequently alfalfa. We've got cotton covered in it now. We've got canola oil. All of these commodities are now covered in this thing before it goes to market. Wheat was one of the early adopters, and that's really kind of led this transition into this gluten-sensitive, cascade that we've seen across the last 2 decades. And so the journey we're on right now is to understand what did we do? And as we back up even into space to look back at Earth, it becomes evident that with this chemical becoming the dominant agricultural chemical, we've destroyed not only soil systems, but water systems, both freshwater and then ultimately the ocean itself. And so the trend that we're seeing now is really linked to its structure and function of the glyphosate molecule, which is at the heart of the Roundup technology. And glyphosate functions as an antibiotic. And also functions to block the methodologies by which our plants produce medicine. And so you've heard for thousands of years that let thy food be thy medicine. That was true up until about 1996. And at which point we started spraying our food with this Roundup chemical, which blocks the production of alkaloids, which are the vast array, over hundreds of versions of these medicines that can show up in everything from your green leafy vegetables to the grains, the seeds, and beyond. And so really an exciting, debut of realization of the power of plant medicine has been marked by the elimination of it at the same time in the last couple of decades. And so we see this explosion of chronic disease happening at the same rate we see the depletion of the soils and water systems on the planet. What are we depleting them of? Namely, the microbiome. And so Roundup has been patented as an antibiotic, anti-parasite, all these things. It kills the micro ecosystem of soil, water, deep ocean, and the rest. And so we're decimating these large ecosystems that we are ultimately very reliant upon for not only our health, but actually our birth. So everything from the motility of a sperm to the way in which cells divide to become an embryo are dependent on the communication between cells that actually find their founding in the microbiome, the bacteria and fungi, and the way in which we communicate across cell systems put into play by the microecosystems.
Yeah. And as you were saying in your talk, nature always has a way of just correcting the wrongs. And Roundup kind of came on the scene and everyone's like, don't worry, trust the authorities. Everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be safe. But you make the connection also with antibiotics and this kind of Cancer Alley. What can you tell us because I never heard any information about Cancer Alley. I've been looking at the effects of antibiotics. I mean, I've been negatively affected by it. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But tell us about Cancer Alley specifically.
Yeah, my background is in cancer research and chemotherapy development. And at the university where I was doing that pharmaceutical research, I was starting to really understand the role of mitochondria in the relationship to cancer cells. And the mitochondria are these little tiny microbes that live inside of our cells, but they're not human. We like to be taught that they're like human organelles inside our cells that produce the power. In fact, there are 3 species of bacterioid creatures that have actually a viral DNA strand. So they're this weird microbiome that lives inside our cells, tiny, tiny little things, and they are robust in our cells. We have somewhere around 200 mitochondria per human cell. Extrapolate that out to the 70 trillion cell, you got about you're around 14 quadrillion mitochondria. So we're plump full of this microecosystem of mitochondria that, interestingly, is being fed by the bacteria and the fungi that is in our gut, in our soil systems, in the air around us, and the rest. And so now we start to spray a broad spectrum antibiotic into our soils, into the water systems, And this water-soluble toxin starts to consolidate in what we now see as the biggest water structure in the U.S., which is the Mississippi River. So the tributaries of the Mississippi start up along the Canadian border, from Montana all the way over to really near the Northeast, and that huge collection throughout the whole North and Midwest and central areas of the country collected into a single water system. And so we see the last 90 miles of that river running between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, Louisiana. That's where we see Cancer Alley, the highest rates of cancer across the whole world. The interesting thing about that is that's not the pattern we saw 14 years before 2007 hit. And so 2007 was when we saw that, we got published that reversal of the cancer map. Previous to 1994, so if you look before the debut of GMO and crops and the Roundup, we see that cancer was really predominant in the Northeast. That was our epicenter. And the one exception to that was prostate cancer, which was Northwest, but it was always Northeast, Northwest, very little cancer death in the South. And so the poverty was just as bad. Our healthcare delivery systems were just as horrible in Mississippi as they are today. It wasn't a lack of healthcare that drove a cancer epidemic, it was a lack of ecosystem. So we killed the ecosystem, and we see this massive rise in cancer of all sorts through that space. And so we come now to realize that the microbial life, the bacteria, the fungi, is really the foundation of the anti-cancer movement, if you will, the new realization of where does cancer come from. It's not a human disease, it's a symptom of a collapse of ecosystem. And so that leads to that cancer epidemic. And then if we keep layering that information on, we quickly find out that the genomic injuries that we see in cancer is through isolation of cells. And so you actually can't get a human cancer cell until you've cut it off from all communication around it. And that's done through a variety of proteins disrupted. Our lab since 2013 has really been working on understanding the mechanisms by which Roundup cleaves all of those communications and connections between human cells to leave loneliness and cell isolation and the opportunity for cancer to develop. And so the average cancer cell has 20 to 25,000 unrepaired genetic injuries in it. You don't get those injuries until well after the isolation event. And so when the World Health Organization says probable carcinogen, the only word we need to remove is probable. Definite carcinogen removes the connections to the space around it. That's the beginning of cancer, along with the collapse of the shape of the mitochondria. Yep. This is all Roundup driven.
And there's so many effects of this. It's not just cancer, but a lot of your serotonin, a lot of your dopamine is linked to your gut. If your gut is not performing as it should, if your diet is bad, if you're just being prescribed antibiotics, which I was. I had a horrible dentist that kept messing up. I kept having tooth infections and have this antibiotic, take another one, and another one, and another one. Just a couple weeks ago, I found myself, having panic attacks and anxieties and depression. Literally just started doing intermittent fasting and taking coconut oil. Every morning I wake up and then not eating for a while, and then I'm feeling so much better than I was just a couple weeks ago. But then I also went through other stuff that was post-traumatic stress and saw a bunch of crazy stuff. But regardless of that, I've kind of correlated with my gut being so important. And as soon as I started taking care of my gut, I feel so much better. My other friend does coffee enemas. There's a lot of misinformation out there. What kind of tips could you give us? Is intermittent fasting, is coconut oil, are coffee enemas something that you see as a solution to this? Is there a safe place to even go to with so much Roundup everywhere? Sorry, I'm throwing like 20 questions at you. But ultimately, to narrow it down, is there a solution to the kind of disorder and chaos out there that has been created by this kind of unnatural antibacterial push?
For sure. Yeah, I think I know there's many things that we can do as individuals, consumers. One important thing is for us to remember that we as consumers created Monsanto. And so in the 1940s, there was no role for large-scale chemical farming because we had innumerable small family farms and we grew about 40% of our food in our backyard gardens. Over the next 2 decades, we would create what's called the Green Revolution. That was the advent of chemical companies taking over large-scale farming. They were seeing themselves as the answer to the Dust Bowl. We had already killed our topsoils through poor soil management, and that created this decimation and starvation throughout the United States. For many of us, it's hard to believe that there were soup lines for miles and massive starvation happening in our own country less than 100 years ago. And so that's difficult to realize until you realize we're in the same situation again. So if we look at the state of Kansas, for example, Kansas is our biggest agricultural state. We cover 90% of its territory with agricultural land, and yet we import 90% of Kansas food. In addition, 1 in 4 children in Kansas goes to sleep hungry every night. Wow. So we have wide-scale famine and food shortage happening in the most agricultural state. Why is that? Largely because we stopped growing food back in the 1960s and 70s, and then it really accelerated with the GMO advent. So with GMO going, we could suddenly allow a single farm family to not manage 300 acres, but to manage 3,000 or now 30,000 acres. And so these massive farms are managed by spraying more and more chemical, spraying in artificial fertilizers that are derived from the petroleum industry and the like. This creates this, complete demolition of this previous economy of local food. Furthermore, those farmers are paid to grow just a few crops, right? So we have something called the Farm Bill, one of the most corrupt pieces of legislation maybe ever created. But the Farm Bill is demanding that farmers grow sugar beets first. It's the best way to make money, grow sugar beets. Sugar's never been shown to be important for human health, probably causes cancer, heart disease, and all the rest. Next is corn and soybean. And it really is irregardless of the economy or the demand for these crops that these farmers are encouraged to grow these crops. And so they're backed by, their borrowing power is backed by what we call crop insurance, which is more of a welfare program, doesn't actually function as insurance. And the welfare program of crop insurance then is the only way that a bank is going to be willing to lend a farmer that's already failing money to put seed and inputs into the soil. And so then the farmer's like, all right, I'll grow another 30,000 acres of crop. In this past year, we've seen a total decimation of the whole economy around our commodity crops because of the tariffs that have been put in place due to our kind of nationalistic behavior that we've had recently, and that those tariffs are absolutely slaughtering the farmer now. Last year, 2018, we see corn prices at minus $64 a bushel, meaning a $64 loss per bushel of corn grown, which means taxpayers had to come along with our farm bill and crop insurance to bail all of that crop out. So we paid out billions of dollars as taxpayers to farmers that couldn't sell their corn because tariffs were there and there was no economy for them. In response to that, the USDA and the crop insurance programs have asked U.S. farmers to grow 3 million more acres of corn this year. There is no natural economy in this space anymore. It's all third-party interests that have organized between chemical, ag, the big banks, and the government itself. And so that's where we're at right now with the economy. And so we started a nonprofit this year, an opportunity to reconnect the individual consumer with farmers again, to take down this bizarre artificial third-person, fourth-person relationships that we had put around these farmers. In 2016 alone, we lost over 8,000 family farms. That number is accelerating each year right now. And so we need to put a halt to this because every family farm that is lost is largely bought up by international conglomerates. America is no longer owning American soil. And so if we're talking as if we're some sort of nationalistic, health, pro-homeland security, government right now, then my question is, then how did we sell 85 to 90% of our seed to a foreign entity? How does Bayer go on to own 95% of our corn crop in the United States? And how does the European and Chinese and African and everything else governments come in to buy up our farmland? We lost homeland security when we lost the family farm. And so our mission with Farmers Footprint is to put the consumer right in direct relationship with those farmers again, create not just a nonprofit, that's just building the infrastructure. We're creating a new economy, a new capitalistic for-profit economy where these farmers can regain financial independence and not be reliant on banking loans every year that keep them locked to this farm bill. I would love to see Kansas farmers growing food for Kansas again. There's been this fallacy that the GMO movement was to feed the world. We're not even feeding our own people anymore. And so we are not feeding the world with genetically modified crops. We're actually making oil, we're making fuel additives, we're making chemicals out of those crops for the processed food industry, for the chemical companies and the rest. And so these crops that look like they're covering 90% of Kansas will go into the chemical industry instead of into the food industry.
Is that the same farmer bill that Donald Trump recently signed that legalized hemp and CBD? Was that the same encompassing one?
This has been a problem much deeper than Trump's administration, for sure. The recent bills on the tariffs and all of that were not linked to the hemp bill, to my knowledge, but not keeping up that. You might have some information I don't. But the big problem we had started in the 70s and accelerated through the Reagan administration as that farm bill got more and more narrow in its spectrum of commodity subsidization.
Yep. And then, I mean, everything here correlates, especially with the rise of depression, the rise of anxiety, the rise of cancer. Meanwhile, our society is supposedly progressing, but there's so much information, there's so much things to look into, and I want to thank you for this wealth of information, this huge download. Anything else you want to say, and where could people find more information about you?
Fantastic. Yeah. When you start to feel hopeless around this topic, one of the best ways to go about it is just remember the simple reality that you are born of nature, and reconnecting to that nature will heal you. And so what we do in our clinics now is, instead of bringing a pharmaceutical approach, we're looking for you to reconnect to Mother Earth in very simple ways. Where are you getting your food from? If you're not growing something, grow something. If that's a basil plant in your window, start there. And get something growing outside. If you don't have land to grow on, start with a community garden in your neighborhood. If you can't do that, then know a CSA, a community supported agricultural system. If you can't do that, then go to the farmer's market. If you can't do that, then just literally get in your car with your family right this weekend and start driving out into the countryside until you find a farmhouse and go knock on that door and say, what do you do? I'm a consumer. I'm concerned for my family. I'm concerned for our health as a nation. Can we sit with you and figure out how we can be part of your process? Take this in your own hands for your own family. The best thing that we could do is really see each other as humans again, instead of cogs in a machine. And your farmers are, I guarantee you, most inventive, creative, independent thinking minds out there. And if you're not connected to farmers, you're missing an opportunity for seeing humanity at its best. So reconnect to farmers. Reconnect to your community through education. FarmersFootprint.us is the website for our nonprofit. FarmersFootprint.us. We've got a lot of resources coming to you in these next couple of weeks. We've got a town hall kit that's going to prepare you with our documentary that you can see on the website now. That's the first of a long documentary series that's coming out. You'll be able to show the film, some PowerPoint presentation, have some print material. But more than that, we also have the toolkit for you to ban Roundup in your municipal areas at your county level. It's worked in Irvine, California first 3 years ago, but even in the last month, we've seen LA County, Miami County, and the rest popping. So you can become part of this massive revolution to say enough is enough with this chemical. We're getting it out of our school systems. We're getting it out of our children who are suffering the cancer epidemic from this cancer, causing compound in our food and water systems. You may think you're safe in your big city, you're away from agricultural spaces, but it turns out that 75% of the air we breathe and 75% of the rainfall is contaminated with Roundup now. And so you've got to get proactive and go after this information at your root cause level, which starts in your family, moves to your local community, the county at large, and let's change the world that we live in.
Beautifully said. As I've always said, the answer is decentralization and small efforts by you as an individual going out there into your community and making a difference. And it starts with you being the change that you want to see in this world. Doctor, thank you so much for the information download. Definitely check out his website and share this video, because obviously Google and YouTube won't. Not just because we confronted Eric Schmidt recently, but because this information is being censored far and wide on the internet right now. Alternative, important information about your health, of course, is being squashed, and the only way to make sure it gets out there is if you get involved and start sharing it. Thank you again so much for watching. Stay tuned for more here on WeAreChange.org. Beautiful. That was really awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, no worries.